I've never been the type to take offense at little things. When your loved ones chuckle at the way you dress, you shrug it off. Just harmless fun. When your granddaughter says you look like a grandma from the 80s, you smile. But one night at a family dinner, I accidentally overheard what they really thought, that I was an embarrassment to the family because of my coat. And that's when it hit me. My appearance mattered to them more than my heart ever did. So I made a decision. No words, no warnings, no apologies, just action. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Mary Louise Carter. I was 68 years old, and I had spent most of my life teaching English literature in a public high school just outside of Portland, Oregon. After my husband died nearly 10 years ago, I stayed in the same small house we'd bought together in the 70s. It was a one-story craftsman-style home with creaky floors, faded curtains, and a garden that grew wild no matter how hard I tried to tame it. It suited me. I had no plans to leave it. My days were quiet and predictable, and that was exactly how I liked them. I read a lot. I baked when the mood struck me. I tended to the roses in the backyard with a kind of reverence that made me feel connected to the earth, to time itself. I wore my days like an old sweater, comfortable, broken in, and just right for the life I'd built after so many years of giving everything I had to my students, to my family, to everyone but myself. And yes, I wore the same old wool coat every winter. It was dark green with wide lapels and a lining that had started to thin out around the shoulders. I'd had it since the early 90s. I remembered buying it with my husband, Frank, at a department store downtown. He'd said it made me look like a woman with opinions, like someone who knew how to command a room without raising her voice. That coat had seen more seasons than some of my neighbors. I never saw any reason to replace it. People dress for all sorts of reasons. Some want to be admired, some want to be invisible. I dressed to be warm, to be comfortable. My shoes were orthopedic and my sweaters were mostly hand-me-downs from my sister. I had one handbag, black and sensible, that had been repaired more times than I could count. I didn't think of myself as sloppy. I thought of myself as practical. But lately, I had started to notice things. When I arrived at family gatherings, there was often a pause, a too long glance at my coat or the scuffed heels of my shoes. My granddaughter Emily, 15 and full of teenage sharpness, once asked me if they even made clothes like mine anymore. I had laughed, thinking it was just a joke, but I saw the way her mother looked away, tight-lipped. I saw the smirk that passed between my niece and her husband during last Christmas dinner when I pulled my gloves from the pocket of that old coat and laid them on the table without thinking. It was always small, barely noticeable, a flicker here, a raised brow there. I told myself not to take it to heart. Families tease, they poke fun. But something about the air had shifted. It was no longer just light teasing. There was a judgment simmering beneath it, quiet but persistent. I overheard things too, things not meant for my ears. My sister once whispered to her daughter that I was stuck in another era, as if I were a misplaced antique instead of a living person with memories and feelings and a bank account that was entirely my own. I heard my nephew joking with his wife that I looked like I was about to teach Sunday school in 1955. They said it with a laugh, but laughter doesn't always mean joy. Still, I didn't say anything. I kept wearing the coat. I told myself it didn't matter. I had long since stopped caring about the opinions of others. I had lived through too much, loss, illness, disappointment, heartbreak, to let someone else's opinion of my wardrobe cut me. But something had started to curl at the edge of my piece, like smoke from a candle long extinguished. It wasn't about the coat. Not really. It was about being seen as less, as behind, as disposable, as someone who belonged to a world that no longer existed. That coat, to me, had always been a symbol of memory, of resilience, of a life lived with care and intention. But to them, it was an eyesore, an embarrassment, proof that I didn't fit their version of how a woman, how a grandmother should look. And for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like maybe I didn't belong. I began to wonder when my presence had shifted from being welcome to being endured. I noticed how I was always seated at the far end of the table now, how they rarely asked for my opinion except when it was about something harmless, like a cookie recipe or a book they assumed I'd read decades ago. I wasn't asked about politics or current events. I wasn't asked about how I felt. I was smiled at, nodded toward, passed over. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I never had, but I also didn't want to be invisible. I never expected gratitude or admiration, but I did expect basic respect. And the truth was, I didn't feel respected anymore. I felt like a costume in a play they'd all outgrown. That winter, when I pulled the coat from the back of my closet and shook it out for another season, I paused. For the first time in years, I held it in my arms and didn't put it on. I just stood there, feeling the rough wool under my fingers, thinking about the woman I had been when I first bought it, and the woman I had become. I wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside me was beginning to stir, something that had lain dormant under decades of politeness and patience, something that did not want to be pitied or dismissed or styled into someone else's image of relevance. That something was beginning to take shape, and I had a feeling that it would not be satisfied with a new coat. It was my great-granddaughter's birthday, and the house was already humming with voices and footsteps by the time I arrived. Balloons twisted around the mailbox, and a folding table outside sagged under the weight of store-bought cupcakes, plastic cups, and a towering punch bowl that glowed an unnatural red. The air was thick with the scent of sugar and grilled hot dogs, and the late afternoon sun made everything shimmer with a kind of too bright cheer. I had worn the coat again, my green wool coat, buttoned all the way to the neck despite the mild weather. It had been a little windy that morning, and the familiar weight of it around my shoulders felt like a kind of armor, even if the lining was thinning and one of the buttons had been re-sewn twice. I also wore my favorite flats, the ones with the worn soles that molded to my feet just right. I didn't think twice about it. When I stepped onto the back patio, children scattered in all directions, shrieking and laughing, chasing each other across the lawn. The adults lingered near the buffet, paper plates in hand, sipping from plastic cups and talking in small groups. I was greeted with a few smiles, a few tight hugs, and the usual chorus of, "Hi, Grandma." "Good to see you, Mary Louise." And "Can you believe she's already 7?" I smiled and nodded and found a quiet spot under the shade of a maple tree where I could watch the scene unfold. I didn't expect to be the center of attention. I liked observing. It was one of the few skills I'd never lost touch with after all those years of teaching, sitting quietly and watching the room without needing to steer it. And then I heard it. I hadn't meant to overhear. I wasn't standing close enough to be obvious, but the breeze carried their voices too clearly to ignore. "She's still wearing that coat," one voice said, half amused, half exasperated. It was my granddaughter, Emily. There was a pause, a muffled laugh, then another voice, her mother's, smooth and careful. "I know. It's like something from an old detective movie. I keep expecting her to pull out a magnifying glass." More laughter, then a lower, unfamiliar voice. "Someone's husband, I assumed?" I honestly thought she was just eccentric, but now I think she's doing it on purpose. Like, look at me. I'm so quirky. Or stubborn, Emily chimed in. It's just kind of embarrassing. I mean, it's a birthday party, not a funeral. The words struck me not like knives, but like stones, heavy, blunt, meant to be tossed, not to kill, but to bruise. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I stood still in the shade of that maple tree, my hands clasped gently in front of me, the hem of my coat brushing my calves as the wind picked up again. The air no longer felt festive. It felt thin and sharp, as if it had been peeled back to reveal something truer underneath. It wasn't what they said exactly. It was the tone, that easy, careless cruelty reserved for people who weren't supposed to hear it. The kind of laughter that comes from knowing you have the upper hand, that the person you're mocking won't fight back. I stayed under that tree for another 10 minutes, maybe more, until the ache in my chest stopped surprising me and started to settle into something else, something quieter and colder. Eventually, I made my way inside. I helped clear a few plates, kissed the birthday girl on the forehead, and slipped out before dessert was served. No one seemed to notice, or if they did, no one stopped me. Driving home, I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't replay the words over and over again like I might have in my younger years, trying to twist them into something less painful. I simply let them exist, let them ring out in the silence of my car, and then dissolve into the air like smoke. I knew what I had heard, and more importantly, I knew what it meant. I had become a symbol to them, not a person, not a woman with her own tastes and choices and reasons, just a character in their story, the quirky grandmother, the outdated matriarch, someone to be joked about, pitied maybe, but not understood, not respected. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I looked at the coat. The green wool had faded slightly, the seams were soft from age, and the sleeves sagged just a little. I still loved it, not because of the way it looked, but because of what it represented. Years of stability, years of getting through winters alone, years of being myself in a world that demanded constant reinvention. But now it carried something else, their laughter. And while I wouldn't throw it away, no, it was still mine, I realized that I no longer wanted to be seen through the filter of their mockery. I wanted something different, not newer, not shinier, just mine, unbothered, undiluted. And if they thought I was eccentric before, they hadn't seen anything yet. I woke early the next morning with that strange heaviness in my chest, the kind that lingers long after the moment that caused it has passed. The house was still and quiet, sunlight filtering in through the gauzy curtains above my kitchen sink. I made coffee as I always did, standing barefoot on the cool tile, letting the steam from the kettle rise into my face. But everything felt different. Everything tasted different. I sipped from my favorite mug, the chipped one with the bluebirds, and tried to shake off the lingering residue of what I had heard the day before. But it clung to me. It sat on my tongue like something sour, something spoiled. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't find comfort in my morning routine. I sat down at the table, surrounded by the things I had built into a kind of sanctuary over the years. The same crocheted placemats, the little vase of dried lavender from last summer, the calendar with watercolor paintings of farmhouses. But nothing felt soft that morning. Everything felt like it was observing me, like the air itself had turned slightly brittle. I told myself it was just a moment, that people say things they don't mean, that families are messy. But the truth was, I wasn't hurt just because they had laughed at my coat. I was hurt because in their laughter, there was something deeper, a disconnection, a dismissal. I had raised my children to be kind. I had poured years of my life into their comfort, their security, their education. I had gone without new clothes, new furniture, vacations, all so they could have what they needed. And I had done it gladly without expectation of thanks, because that's what you do when you love someone. You give. But somewhere along the way, that giving had been reinterpreted as something else, something weaker. I had become invisible not through neglect, but through familiarity. They had seen me for so long that they had stopped seeing me entirely. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. But I felt the ache in my stomach, in my teeth, in the back of my throat. It was a tightness, an inner pressure, the kind that made food taste like cardboard and sunlight feel like a glare instead of a balm. I spent the afternoon cleaning, not because the house was dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I scrubbed the baseboards. I wiped down the inside of the cabinets. I reorganized the pantry even though it had already been in perfect order. I worked until my knees ached and my fingertips were raw, but the hurt stayed. It was like tasting bitterness you can't rinse from your mouth, no matter how many glasses of water you drink. I kept thinking back to their voices, the casualness of it all, how easy it had been for them to mock me, how little it cost them to throw me under the wheels of their humor for the sake of a laugh. It wasn't that they had meant to wound me. That would have almost been easier. It was that they hadn't thought of me as someone who could be wounded at all. That kind of pain is harder to name. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or melodrama. It's a quiet erosion, a hollowing out. It makes you question the stories you've told yourself about where you belong and how others see you. I sat in my living room as the sky turned the color of ash and rose, the light stretching long across the floorboards. I stared at the framed pictures on the mantel. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, smiling faces, arms wrapped around each other. Moments we had frozen in time. I wondered how many of those smiles had been real. How many of those arms had held me out of habit and not affection. I wasn't bitter, not yet, but I was tasting the first notes of it. The metallic sharpness of disappointment, the slow burn of disillusionment. It curled around the edges of my piece and made itself comfortable there. I thought about the coat, about how I had chosen it so long ago with pride, with intention, about how it had weathered winters and funerals and first days of school, about how it had held me, wrapped me, protected me. And now it had become a punchline, a shorthand for everything about me they no longer valued. I folded it carefully that evening and placed it at the back of my closet, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed a break. I needed to remember who I was outside of what they saw. I needed to remember that my worth did not hang on a hanger. Later, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the ways I had made myself smaller over the years, to keep peace, to avoid conflict, to make room for others. I thought about how often I had brushed aside little slights and quiet humiliations, about how often I had mistaken endurance for grace. That night, I did not fall asleep easily. I lay there for a long time with my hands folded across my stomach, listening to the creaks of the house and the distant sound of a dog barking 2 blocks over. And as the hours stretched thin around me, one clear truth formed in the silence. I was done apologizing for who I was, and I was ready to act, not to prove a point, but to reclaim something I had lost slowly and silently over the years. Not my dignity. I had never surrendered that, but my voice. And this time, I wasn't going to use it in words. This time, I was going to move. It began the way many of my days began, quietly. I had no grand intention when I left the house that morning. I didn't dress differently or carry any particular energy with me. I simply put on a light sweater, tied my shoes, and stepped out into the soft hum of my neighborhood, letting my feet guide me with no set destination. The air was cool but not cold, and there was a certain clarity to the sky, a brightness that made everything feel freshly washed. I walked past the neighbors' yards, admiring the peonies and rhododendrons blooming in vibrant defiance of the still chilly breeze. I passed children waiting at the corner for the school bus, a golden retriever watching the world with lazy interest from a screened-in porch, and the mail carrier making his rounds with methodical grace. I didn't wave to anyone. I didn't feel like being seen, not yet. That day, I wanted to move through the world quietly, as though it owed me nothing and I owed it nothing in return. The downtown strip was only a mile away, and I found myself drawn to it like I often was when I needed space from my thoughts. I wandered slowly past the bakery with the lemon sugar scent that always made my mouth water, past the thrift store with faded signs in the window, and the little bookstore where I used to host poetry readings for my students decades ago. I turned the corner onto a side street I hadn't walked in some time and noticed a real estate office tucked between a florist and a yoga studio. It was small, unassuming, with a large window that looked like it hadn't been washed since fall. There was a display of printed listings taped to the glass, pictures of kitchens gleaming with granite countertops, living rooms dressed up for the camera with staged pillows and fruit bowls. I didn't stop on purpose. I only meant to glance. But something caught my eye. A photo of a house, a modest little cottage, white with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. It was nothing extravagant. It didn't scream wealth or prestige. It whispered peace. The way the light hit the front steps, the shape of the windows, the way the flower beds framed the walkway like open arms. It looked like someone had loved it. I don't know how long I stood there staring. The wind pulled at the hem of my sweater, and my fingers rested gently on the cool glass. I read the listing details: 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a small garden, walking distance to the water. It was just far enough from my current life to feel new, but not so far as to feel like an escape. For a long moment, I let myself imagine. I pictured myself on that porch in the early morning, a cup of coffee in hand, my hair loose and gray in the breeze. I saw the inside filled with soft light, a small wooden table by the window, bookshelves full of poetry and history, a bedroom with a quilt I had made years ago. I imagined planting lavender and tomatoes in the backyard, hosting no one unless I wanted to, setting my own rules, writing letters I'd never have to send. It wasn't just the house, it was the possibility of it, of starting over without starting again, of making a decision that belonged only to me. The door to the office opened as a young woman stepped out, holding a clipboard. She smiled politely, asked if I was interested. I almost said no. I almost turned and kept walking. But instead, I surprised myself. I said yes. I said I'd like to know more. I said it like I was ordering tea. Calm, unassuming. But inside, I felt the pulse of something rare and thrilling, something like power. She invited me in and offered me a seat. The office smelled like paper and old coffee, and the walls were lined with binders and brochures. She pulled up the listing on her screen and began telling me about the property, its history, the owners who had recently moved to Arizona, how long it had been on the market. I nodded, asked a few questions, but I already knew. I knew I wanted it the moment I saw it. We scheduled a viewing for the following morning. I walked home slower than before, the weight of the idea settling into my bones. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell my sister or Emily or anyone else who might ask questions or offer opinions disguised as concern. I tucked the plan away like a folded note in my chest, letting it warm quietly against my ribs. By the time I returned home, the light had changed. The house looked the same as it always had, unassuming, square, worn around the edges. The front steps still creaked. The screen door still stuck halfway if you didn't tug it just right. But I saw it differently now, not as a burden, not as a trap, just as something that had served its time. That evening, I ate a simple dinner. I didn't turn on the television or the radio. I didn't need noise. I needed quiet to think, to feel, to let the idea root itself deeper inside me. I went to bed early, pulling the blanket up to my chin and listening to the house settle. I knew change was coming, not tomorrow, not in a blaze, but in steps, quiet ones, like the ones I had taken that morning. And I would keep walking, in silence, in peace, on a path that, for once, belonged entirely to me. The next morning I woke before the sun, the sky still a soft, uncertain gray. I dressed in my quiet way, pulling on my softest jeans, a sweater that had seen better days, and a pair of sneakers that had molded perfectly to the shape of my feet over the years. I didn't bother with makeup or jewelry. Today wasn't about presentation. It was about decision. It was about making a deal with myself that I would not back down from. The streets were still damp with the remnants of the night's rain as I made my way to the small real estate office. The town stirred slowly to life around me. Coffee shops pulling up their shades, joggers with determined faces threading along the sidewalks, shopkeepers setting out racks of sale items. Everything in the world seemed to be moving with quiet certainty, and I drew strength from that rhythm. When I arrived, the young agent, whose name I learned was Stephanie, greeted me with an easy smile and a clipboard of papers tucked under her arm. She was efficient and kind, sensing perhaps that I didn't want chatter, only clarity. She led me to her car and we drove the short distance to the house. It looked even better in person. The porch was wider than I had realized, the white paint a little chipped, but nothing a fresh coat wouldn't fix. The front door was deep blue, worn just enough at the edges to hint at stories it had witnessed. The garden beds were sleeping under the last crusts of winter, but I could already see the promise in them. Dark, rich soil waiting for life. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. There were no grand spaces, no towering ceilings or designer finishes, just a simple, sturdy beauty. A small fireplace in the living room, a kitchen with a window above the sink that looked out to the backyard, a bedroom with enough light to wake up smiling. Stephanie moved around the house with practiced ease, pointing out features, mentioning recent updates. I listened, but mostly I listened to myself, to the way my heart felt steady, the way my breathing stayed slow. No flicker of doubt, no twinge of hesitation. It wasn't just a house, it was a line in the sand, a quiet but unmistakable declaration that I would no longer be content shrinking into the corner of my own life. After we toured the rooms, Stephanie turned to me and asked if I'd like to think about it. I shook my head. I had done enough thinking. More thinking would only invite fear, the kind that creeps in wearing the mask of practicality and good sense. The kind that keeps you planted in places that no longer fit, just because staying still feels safer than stepping forward. I told her I was ready to make an offer. The process moved quickly after that. Stephanie smiled in that relieved way young professionals do when they know they've made a sale without needing to hard sell it. We returned to her office where she pulled out forms, pens, copies of copies. I sat at her desk, feeling the strange weight of the moment settle around my shoulders, not heavy like regret, heavy like a cloak you choose to wear into the unknown. There were numbers, figures, discussions about inspections and closing costs. I nodded, signing where she pointed, initialing where needed. My hand was steady, my voice was clear. Every signature was a promise to myself that I would not apologize for choosing differently, that I would not allow guilt or obligation to pry me back into the life I had so carefully stepped away from. As we wrapped up, Stephanie asked if there was anyone she should call to share the good news. Family, perhaps. I smiled gently and told her no. Thank you. This was mine. Mine to hold. Mine to celebrate. Mine to live through, alone if necessary, proud if nothing else. Walking back out into the morning sun, I felt taller somehow. Not in a way that others would see, but in the way my spirit filled the space around me more fully. I stopped for a coffee on the way home, sitting at a corner table by the window, with my cup cradled between my palms. I watched the town move around me, the steady stream of life carrying on, without knowing that something had shifted inside me in a way that could not be undone. I thought about how easy it had been for them to laugh at me, how effortless it had been for them to define me by the way I dressed, by the way I lived, by the quiet choices they never cared enough to understand, and how easy it would have been for me to let them, to shrink further, to accept that mockery as truth. But sitting there, sipping my coffee, the papers in my bag, and the key soon to be in my hand, I realized something else. I had never needed their permission to live my life. I had never needed their approval to dress or think or choose as I pleased. I had only needed to remember that this house was not a revenge. It was not a middle finger raised against the laughter behind my back. It was something far simpler and far more powerful. It was a choice, a deal struck quietly between the woman I had been and the woman I was finally allowing myself to become. No announcements, no explanations, just a key, a door, a new beginning. And me, finally, standing at the center of my own life again. The day I officially closed on the house, I did not tell a soul. Not my sister, not my children, not my granddaughter. I didn't drop hints or share a casual remark over lunch or slip a detail into a phone call. I kept it entirely to myself, the way one keeps a secret garden, growing something new away from the eyes of those who would only see weeds where beauty was beginning. It wasn't out of spite. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something quieter and far more sacred: sovereignty. I didn't want to defend my decision. I didn't want to field the barrage of well-meaning questions disguised as concern or polite disbelief laced with judgment. I didn't want to be asked why I needed to move, or whether I was lonely, or whether I'd finally realized I was too old to be living in that drafty old place. I had made a choice, a full adult informed choice, and I had done it on my terms. That afternoon, I picked up the keys and held them in the palm of my hand like a talisman. They were simple, unmarked silver keys with a tiny plastic tag that bore the address in smudged ink. I turned them over in my fingers again and again, feeling the edges, the coolness of the metal, the heft that felt too light for how much they now carried. I didn't pack with haste or urgency. I moved in rhythms that felt honest and unrushed. I donated what no longer felt like mine. I boxed up the things I wanted to carry forward, not just objects, but memories that still felt warm to the touch: books, old letters, my favorite mugs, the Afghan I had knitted with my own hands the winter Frank was ill, a photo of my mother, forever young in a black and white frame. Each item I placed in a box was a decision, a declaration. This stays with me. This I release. The moving truck arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning. The driver was a young man with a kind face and a soft voice. He didn't ask questions. He loaded the furniture with care and didn't treat me like a fragile thing. I followed behind him in my car, my hands steady on the wheel, my breath even. There was no sadness, no pang of regret, only the sure, gentle unfolding of something I had waited too long to claim. When we reached the new house, the movers worked quickly. The sound of boxes being shuffled, doors creaking open, footsteps moving across clean floors. It all filled the air with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I stood in the middle of the living room and let it wash over me, the light pouring through the windows, catching dust motes in its hands. It felt like a blank page. When they left, I closed the door softly behind them and stood alone in my new space. The silence wasn't hollow, it was full of potential. I walked through each room barefoot now, listening to the way my steps echoed differently than they had before. I opened every cabinet. I ran my fingers along every wall. I opened the back door and stepped into the garden, still sleepy in early spring. I breathed it all in and let it settle inside me. There was no one to congratulate me, no one to clap me on the back or say, "I'm proud of you." But I didn't need that. I didn't need witnesses to validate my freedom. I spent the first night sleeping on the couch, wrapped in a quilt, the windows cracked just enough to let in the nighttime breeze. I fell asleep to the sound of wind chimes and distant waves, and I slept better than I had in years. Over the next few days, the texts and calls came. "Are you home? Where are you?" We stopped by and no one answered. I let them wait. I let the silence speak for me. Eventually, I sent a short message. "I've moved. I'm safe. I'm happy. No need to worry." I did not include an address. I did not invite anyone to visit. I let them sit with that, as I had so often sat in the silence of their assumptions. They responded the way I expected, confused, curious, lightly concerned, but none of them asked why in a way that told me they truly wanted to know. They asked to soothe their own discomfort, not to understand mine, and so I offered no details. For the first time in decades, I felt no need to explain myself. I didn't explain why I had kept it a secret. I didn't explain why I had left the house behind. I didn't explain what had pushed me past the point of tolerance. Freedom isn't about escape, it's about truth. And the truth was, they didn't need to know everything. They had spent years building a version of me that fit their story, predictable, passive, pleasantly invisible. I had stepped outside of that story. I had written a new chapter without inviting their edits. Some days, I sat on the porch with my tea and thought about what they might be saying. I imagined the conversations, the conclusions drawn, the narratives spun. I didn't mind. Let them wonder. Let them circle the questions without answers. This life, this space, was mine. No explanations required. The envelope was small, square, and ivory-colored. No return address, just a simple gold-edged card tucked inside. I had written only a few lines. I didn't bother with pleasantries or explanations, just the essentials. "I've moved. This is my new address. I'm doing well. I hope you are too." I mailed one to each of them, my children, my granddaughter, my sister. It wasn't a peace offering or a request for reconnection. It was a formality, a statement of fact. I existed elsewhere now, and they were free to know that or ignore it. Either way, I was no longer part of the world they had comfortably kept me in. I dropped the envelopes into the blue mailbox by the pier one sunny morning, then walked to the bakery and treated myself to a slice of lemon loaf and a strong coffee. The sun glinted off the ocean in the distance, and the breeze carried the scent of salt and early blooming lilacs. I felt light in a way I hadn't in years. Not weightless exactly, more grounded, present, like I had finally stepped fully into my own life. Days passed, then weeks. A few cards came back, not handwritten letters, not calls, just cards. Generic, pleasant, harmless. So glad to hear you're well. Congratulations on the move. Let's catch up soon. None of them asked why. Not really. Not with any depth or honesty. And I didn't push. I had made peace with the fact that some people prefer distance when confronted with a version of you that no longer fits their expectations. I wasn't angry, just uninterested in returning to a dynamic that had required me to apologize for the space I took up. My new address didn't just signify a different zip code. It marked a boundary, one they could cross if they came with respect and sincerity, but not with pity, not with forced politeness, and not with the quiet judgment that had followed me for years like a shadow no one would name. I filled my days with small joys. The backyard, still wild and tentative, became my favorite space. I planted marigolds and thyme, set up a bench under the old elm tree, and often took my lunch outside just to feel the sun on my skin and the soil beneath my feet. I kept a journal, not of deep thoughts or dramatic insights, but of moments. The first daffodil bloom, the neighbor's cat that started visiting my porch, the way my breath felt steady after a morning walk by the sea. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt earned. I made friends, slowly, gently, the way people do when they're no longer in a rush to impress. There was Elaine from the bookstore who shared my love for Alice Munro. Gerald, the retired postman who lived 2 doors down and still whistled the same tune every morning. And Rosa, who ran the cafe and knew I liked my tea strong, no sugar. They knew me simply as Mary, not Grandma Mary, not Mom, not the one who always wears that coat. Just Mary. And I liked that. It reminded me that I was more than the roles I had played. One afternoon, I received a knock at the door. It was Emily. She looked different, older, more tentative, a bit nervous around the edges. She held a small bag with a lemon tart inside. I thanked her and invited her in. We sat in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming in through the window, the air thick with things unsaid. She asked questions, gentle, respectful ones. I answered only what I felt like sharing. She didn't push, and for the first time in years, we spoke like 2 people meeting each other again, not like a grandchild trying to decode the silence of a grandmother she thought she understood. When she left, she hugged me, not tightly, not dramatically, but with warmth. She didn't ask when she could come again. She didn't promise to bring the others. She didn't make any grand declarations. And that was fine. That was honest. The next day, I baked a tart of my own. I wrapped it, walked to the post office, and sent it to her. My way of saying, I see you too. The house grew more mine with every passing day. I painted the front door yellow. I hung wind chimes by the window. I placed a rocking chair on the porch and found myself sitting there most evenings, wrapped in a shawl, watching the horizon shift from gold to violet to deep blue. This new address had no ghosts, no expectations pressed into the walls, no legacy I had to protect or live up to. It was just a house, but it held a life, my life, fully mine. No one would mistake me for someone who wanted to be invisible now. I hadn't vanished. I had simply relocated to a place that finally felt like home. I learned that the most expensive thing a woman can give away is her dignity. Not all at once, not in grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but in the small daily negotiations we make in the name of peace. For years I had done that. I had swallowed my own comfort to maintain theirs, folded my preferences to keep the room calm, edited myself down to a version that didn't offend or disrupt. And for what? A seat at a table that kept pushing me further to the edge? After I moved, I spent a lot of time sitting with that truth, not mourning it, just studying it, the way you study a scar on your own body, tracing its edges, recalling the wound, honoring the fact that you survived it. I didn't regret the years I had spent giving. Love, after all, was never wasted. But I finally understood what it had cost me, and I knew with painful clarity that I would never pay that price again. Living in the new house had changed me in ways no one could see. The exterior of my life looked simple, ordinary, but inside everything had shifted. I no longer rushed to explain myself. I no longer felt guilty for choosing solitude over performance, peace over pretense. I didn't need to be the accommodating mother, the agreeable grandmother, the woman who smiled through discomfort just to keep everyone else comfortable. I had earned something that couldn't be measured in money or approval. I had earned the right to define what my love looked like and what it no longer included. One afternoon, I received a call from my son. His voice was careful, the way people sound when they're stepping around something sharp. He asked how I was. He told me they missed me. He asked if I might consider coming by for Thanksgiving. I thanked him for calling. I said I was grateful for the invitation, but I didn't say yes. That year, I spent Thanksgiving walking along the coast in a thick scarf and gloves. The sky the color of steel, the waves restless and wild. I ate dinner alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I roasted a small chicken, made mashed potatoes the way Frank liked them, and lit a candle just for myself. I played old jazz records and left the dishes in the sink until morning, and I thought, this is what peace looks like. It isn't grand or loud. It doesn't need to be announced. It just sits with you like a friend who knows all your stories and doesn't need you to perform any of them. Sometimes I wondered if they understood what had changed. If they realized that the woman they used to joke about, the one with the old coat and the quiet eyes, had drawn a line so deep she would never cross it again. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need validation. I had already done the most important thing. I had stopped waiting for them to see me, and I had seen myself. That was my price, the cost of reclaiming a self I had lost in service to everyone else's comfort. The cost of choosing silence when explanation would only feed the same old cycle. The cost of walking away with no theatrics, no final word, just a closed door and a new key in my hand. They still sent cards sometimes, invitations, updates. Occasionally, someone would ask if I'd changed my number since I wasn't always quick to reply. I hadn't. I just no longer felt urgency to be everywhere at once, to hold up the family scaffolding while no one noticed I was crumbling underneath. I would always love them. That hadn't changed. But love without respect is just endurance dressed up as virtue, and I was done enduring. The new house became a reflection of that shift. Every piece of furniture, every curtain, every flower in the garden was chosen with the care of someone who had stopped asking what others would think. I painted one wall a deep emerald green, hung up a large painting I had kept in a closet for years because it was too bold for the old house. I bought new clothes, simple, yes, but strong. Not fashionable, not invisible, just honest. I still had the old coat. I kept it in the back of a closet, not because I was ashamed of it, but because it no longer needed to prove anything. It had carried me through. It had done its job. And now, so had I. There's a quiet power in choosing your own value, in refusing to accept that love means shrinking, in saying no without guilt, in building a life that asks nothing from others but the truth, and offering only the same in return. This was my price, and I had paid it in full, with silence, with dignity, with freedom.